Now, how does John get this down to 10? Raymond Brown tells us that John, in fact, gave us a variety of the same narrative in order to demonstrate some apologetic motifs. He wanted to show us that Thomas, the doubting one, will have the same kinds of doubts that we readers of his Gospels may have even today, but the doubts were already answered. So Thomas wasn't there. Why? Because John removed him. Not in fact, but for the literary purpose of creating this discourse to prove a point. So if the writers are writing to prove points like this, then to what extent can we believe in their narratives? And can we really distill certain unavoidable facts from this sort of narrative that they have put before us, when we can see that they actually tailor the narrative to suit these apologetic motifs? Dr. Craig, in his book, Reasonable Faith, actually in the introduction, recommends another book, A History of Apologetics by Robert Dulles. And Robert Dulles in his book, in his book, actually tells us that the history of apologetics begins with the Gospels themselves. Each of the Gospel is an apologetic work. They're not academic discourses telling us all of the facts. They're giving us one side of that mug. And in order for us to understand the whole picture, we have to not only put all of the text together, but we also have to be circumspect. We have to look around to see if the rest of the mug is really there. Paul tells us that Jesus appeared to the 12. But by this time, there never was a 12. There were either 11 as in Luke, or there was 10 as in John. But there never was a 12 at this time, because of the 12 disciples, Judas Iscariot had betrayed Jesus, and he met his own deserved end. So maximum 11. How did Paul say 12? So you see then that the fact of who Jesus appeared to and when cannot be corroborated from one gospel to another. If Dr. Craig says, look, the multiple attestation, we do not have these multiple attestations. What we have is our individual reports that contradict each other in a fundamental way. Thank you.
Well, I find myself in something of a quandary here in that I don't disagree with hardly anything that SHABIR has just said in his speech. Remember, I said I would defend 5 facts in tonight's debate. First of all, that Jesus was tried and crucified, that he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb, that tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers on Sunday morning, that he then after appeared to various individuals and groups of people, and that the original disciples came to believe in his resurrection despite every predisposition to the contrary. And I gave multiple lines of evidence in favor of each of those points. Now, SHABIR has quibbled about the details, but he hasn't disagreed with any of those points, because I think he knows that these are historical facts that are accepted by the majority of historians today. What he did do was exactly what I said in my first speech I would not do, namely, worry about the inerrancy of the Gospels and the little details and secondary features of the narratives. Rather, what I'm focusing on is the historical core of these narratives, however you may want to judge the historicity of the secondary details. And the fact is that despite all of the inconsistencies that SHABIR wants to mention, the core of these narratives is recognized as historical today. Michael Grant is a secular historian, and he writes this in his book, Jesus, an Historian's Review of the Gospel. True, the discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels. But, he says, if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. As an example, in secular ancient history, Livy and Polybius give us 2 irreconcilable accounts of Hannibal's campaign to cross the Alps with elephants in his war against Rome. They're incompatible with each other, but no doubts that Hannibal, in fact, did mount such a campaign against Rome. So the fact of the matter is that the gospel accounts are historical in their core, however you might adjudge these secondary details. In fact, all 4 gospels agree that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in Jerusalem by Roman authority during the Passover feast having been arrested and convicted on charges of blasphemy by the Jewish Sanhedrin, and then slandered before the Roman governor Pilate on charges of treason. He died within several hours and was buried Friday afternoon by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb which was sealed with a stone. Certain women followers of Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, mentioned by name, having observed his interment, visited his tomb early on Sunday morning, only to find it empty. Thereafter, Jesus appeared alive from the dead to the disciples, including Peter, who became proclaimers of the message of his resurrection. All four of the Gospels attest to all of those facts. If you were to include facts that were mentioned by, say, 3 out of the 4, well, then even more details could be added to the list. But I think it's clear that the core is well attested. In fact, N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, in his book on the resurrection, says that the empty tomb and appearances have such a historical probability as to be virtually certain, like the death of Augustus in AD 14 or the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That is how well established these appearances and the discovery of the empty tomb are. Now, as I look more closely at what Shabir had to say, he didn't present any arguments against the crucifixion. He didn't deny the burial by Joseph of Arimathea. With respect to the empty tomb, he again said there are later developments in the Gospels, but again, that's why I focus on the core facts. He points out, with respect to the appearances, that Mark's Gospel ends before narrating any appearances. That's true, but Mark does foreshadow an appearance in Galilee, which is then narrated in Matthew as well as in John. And you can use the Greek New Testament to read these in the original languages, such as I do, so that we can read the original manuscripts as they actually existed. With respect to the appearances, he says there's no corroborating evidence of the appearances, and that's simply false, as I explained in my first speech. In the Gospels, we have multiple independent sources for these appearances. The appearance to Peter is attested by both Luke and independently by Paul. The appearance to the 12, independently by Luke, John, and Paul. The appearance to women by Matthew and John, and the Galilean appearances by Mark, Matthew, and John. This is one of the surest marks of historicity, because you have independent sources narrating the same event, which increases the historical credibility of those events. And finally, I pointed out that the original disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection was something that needs to be explained. Now, what is the best explanation of these? Well, I think it is the one the disciples gave, namely that God raised Jesus from the dead. What Shabir contends in his published work is that the best explanation is to say that Jesus was taken down from the cross barely alive, placed in the tomb, and then God assumed him directly into heaven before he could die. Now, I want to make a few observations about this theory. First of all, a preliminary observation. No true Muslim can hold to this view. The Quran is very straightforward and unambiguous. It says, وَمَا خَدَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ. They did not kill him. They did not crucify him. The ambiguity that Shabir is talking about is in the latter part of that verse, وَإِنَّمَا شُبِهَ لَهُمْ, which says it only appeared to them that they did. But the first part is very clear, straightforwardly and unambiguously. The Quran says they did not crucify Jesus. They did not kill